I started this podcast. I mean, it was actually not super long ago. It's been a pretty wild beyond expectations, response to it. And I'm so grateful that people are enjoying it. It feeds my desire to want to do more and more and more and more and more with it. So you guys may be stuck with me for a while, side note on that. But I never really talked about, with the exception of the origin story of, I did start a company. The company was called Turn Therapeutics. That company was born out of the fact that, I went through a horrific health crisis. I had 21 surgeries and sepsis and chronic abscesses and was a chronic wound patient and wanted a product that would ultimately help me with those wounds, and then realized that this could help a lot of other people with their wounds. And then along the way, it became a company, and we got investors, and we got, contracts and license deals, and it just kept growing and growing and growing in this beautiful and unexpected way. But last week, I did something that was probably the most surreal experience I've ever had, which was I actually stood at NASDAQ in New York Times Square, and I rang the bell as our company went public with all of my friends and my family and some of my oldest supporters and shareholders around me. Um, and I gave a speech, and my face was like 70 feet high on a jumbotron. So my apologies to people who had to stare at that for like an hour, by the way. But man, that was wild. Especially when you don't know, when you're starting, where things are going to go, to experience a moment like that. And if anything, it makes me think back to a speech I gave in 2019 at a UCLA graduation about finding your why. I've always been into that concept of your why. You know, there was even a quote from a philosopher who was a Holocaust survivor named Viktor Frankl, who said, "He who has a why can suffer anyhow." And fuck, did I have a lot of, suffering along the way. There's been a lot of romantic stories about the inspiring, you know, cure from, desperation, and I'm so happy that it inspires people. Like, that actually makes me feel very good that, it can motivate people to do, hard things in the face of, rough times. But there were a lot of not romantic points, but man, that why was strong. I had a product in front of me, and I was staring at just cold, hard facts, objective data, that this product could help a lot of people, like everybody in theory, that might have a wound, or, and all these other things that it became, indications in other areas. And it didn't matter the how. The how was, I'm going to use my cell phone number as our customer support number on the back of the tube. While companies like Johnson and Johnson, have call centers to handle that kind of stuff. It didn't matter that they had sales forces of thousands of people, and I had me and a really beat up gray suitcase that, here's a picture of that we'll put on the screen, had holes in the side of it from 500,000 miles of traveling to hand out samples to people in wound clinics. My how was atypical, but my why was just incessant, which is that I have to do every single thing I can to get this product into the hands of people that it might help. If I don't, then my compass that I use, when I make decisions in life, my compass that I use when I, decide a path that I want to pursue is this something that my kids someday, or their kids, will be proud to tell the story about? And here we are. We're a publicly traded company. We have access to, a large financing instrument, and now we can help millions of people. We have this broad shareholder base of thousands of people, long-term supporters, new shareholders that just maybe got in when we got on the market. This really just communal group of people that actually feels, like they all want to be part of a movement, not just part of a company that has, financials that can do better or worse, and they're hoping to, bet on the way up. So when you want to innovate and you really want to, like, buck the standard, you've got to break stuff, is what it comes down to. So the algorithm that people traditionally follow for building a company, especially in healthcare, from like concept to commercial, is very just sort of tried and true. I didn't do any of it, but it's sort of tried and true for everybody else. You have an idea, you do some lab studies on it, possibly as a grad student, you get a grant or you get some initial seed funding, you find a venture capital firm, you do 17 more financing rounds, and then ultimately at some point you become a public company. When I was 35 years old, and working on this company, I had barely even been taught what quarterly taxes were. You're talking to a guy who went from undergrad in sociology to a master's degree in education and then did doctoral work in behavioral neuroscience. I was not a pharma guy. I was not an MBA. Um, I was not, you know, raised and reared, in an entrepreneurial setting. I had no idea what I was doing, but I just knew that I was going to keep doing it. Let's talk for a moment, though, about the not so romantic parts of this journey. The grind sort of left behind, maybe you could say. Like when I was ordering chemicals from Alibaba.com, that I was mixing in my garage using a mortar mixer that I got from Amazon for $69. Um, and not fully understanding at that point, how to create this fusion process of basically mixing oil and water and using myself as a human guinea pig, by the way, along the way. Where's that old Thomas Edison quote, you know, there's 300 ways to do something wrong. All you need is one way to do it right. Some kind of a quote to that effect. It's something that I feel like people out there could really resonate with, especially ones that have, built something from nothing. And I also feel like it's something that people could take a lot away from. If you're on the edge of trying something hard, if you're worried that you might fail, failure is amazing. A man I know says failing forward. Failure is just a pit stop on the way to finding the right answer. I encourage failure. I encourage fast failure. I encourage learning from failure. I cannot tell you how many times I failed trying to make this product in the beginning. I lost count. I mean, it had to have been 100. And it's loony to look at all the clothes probably that I ruined along the way and, the number of nights that I spent in a garage with a mortar mixer and a friggin' shovel, scooping goo into pots and pans and trying to frappe things together to create something for myself. But I failed hard. I mean, I was also using myself as my own guinea pig, at the time. I mean, I gave myself a third-degree burn on my arm. There's a picture of me in a bandage, that I can show you from that trip to the doctor. He was already having to deal with the fact that I had chronic infections, and he had to deal with the fact that I got a third-degree burn on my arm. So he was super excited about that. Warren Buffett says, you don't really understand success until you failed so hard it stings. I can tell you I third-degree burned. So if you're out there and you're afraid of failure, don't be. Be afraid of failing and not getting back up, quickly learning from it and moving to the next thing. If you've got the why, you can suffer any how. I don't know how many times I'm going to repeat this through that show, but we're going to talk more about those hows. Now, how do you, as a single person, definitely single. I was living in my mom's house at 37 years old, by the way, while building this company. So dating was not optimal at that point because everybody wants to date a broke guy in debt on a credit line living at his parents' house. Another story altogether. But that's what you do, when you're building a company. It is not always glamorous. It is not always romantic. Sometimes it is in the spare bedroom at your mom's house. So what do you do when you are the individual with a crookedly printed tube of an FDA cleared product that you did at Kinko's for $24,000, trying to go up against billion-dollar companies with decades of product familiarity, and you say, hey, I want to replace that. You just start going. You just get moving. You just create forward momentum. And you maintain a sense of optimism that if something's going to happen here. If I can help one person, I can help two. If I can help two person, I can help four. And that's what I did. I got that credit line I talked about before. I jumped on a plane. I flew 500,000 miles over a couple of years, handing out samples of those crooked tubes. And then people started calling me from the Cleveland Clinic, from Northwestern, from the Veterans Administration saying this stuff is preventing people from having to have amputations. You should come out and meet some of them. I got on planes. I'll never forget a trip to Virginia I took once where I actually pretended I was a sales rep for the company, not actually the guy who created the product. And I got to listen to the patients tell their stories about, that they were going to get their foot amputated and they got to keep their foot and they were crying. And I told them that I was the one who created the product at one point, and they hugged me, and it was like the tightest hug. And those are those memorable moments. And that was a why. When you see that kind of thing happen from something that you created, in a desperate state, doing what you hoped it might do for other people, that keeps you going. Another how. What do you do when everybody thinks you're crazy? Because you think you can do something that seems impossible to them. Well, I had a chance to say last week in NASDAQ a little something about the word impossible. So at some point, flying was impossible. I think Boeing and Airbus might have something to say about that right now. At some point, creating a car that could drive you to work was impossible, let alone creating a car. And I think if you look at the current things that we could go down the street and buy right now, that word impossible might seem a little bit subjective. So if this episode of this podcast can do anything, it should encourage people to remember that if your why is strong enough, you can break through anyhow. My hows were, absurd at times. My hows were one person up against a $300 billion company. I'm going to displace that product. And now we're becoming a credible threat to that because I never gave up. My why pushed me through. My hows were I have nobody around me who knows a thing about what I'm doing. My hows were I had never even heard of a venture capital fund or ways to, find investors, but I had people around me that had, and they were good to me and they supported me. My hows were I didn't know how to get to the people that I needed to get to. I picked up the phone and I called them. And they met with me and they took time out of their lives and they supported me. And those people stood next to me at NASDAQ last week in New York. People who never had to do anything for me, but were just happy to help somebody whose goal was not just build a big financial, monster of an enterprise, was to actually build a mission-driven company that could help millions of people. If your why is meaningful, if your why is something that can inspire some other people typically want to be a part of it. So the hows along the way occasionally feel insurmountable. And you're supposed to fail. I have failed so hard that it gave me a third-degree burn. So fail forward, fail fast, fail often, learn, pick yourself back up, get back moving, and remember your why. You're going to encounter resistance. You're going to meet haters. You're going to meet people who think you're crazy. You're going to meet people who tell you this is stupid, you shouldn't do it, go do this, and that's a much more stable platform to build a life upon. And you know what? When you're standing celebrating the success of the entity, the concept, the business, the paper, the charity, the goal, whatever your goal was, whatever why you had drew you toward, with the people that supported you along the way, all of those naysayers just become noise in the background. They become memes. They become things you want to draw pictures of, on your phone afterward. They become things you could put silly hats on, for entertainment value. Because it's kind of fun for a moment to think, well, they didn't believe in me. But here we are. Most people go public to get an exit. I went public for our company to get access to this financing instrument that we had put in place, because that meant I didn't just have to focus on one thing anymore or two things. It meant that I could help people in all different areas, from wound care to dermatology to infectious disease to global health. I would venture a guess that a lot of the listeners to this show feel frustrated at times with conditions that they may be dealing with or conditions that their children may be dealing with. And I hope that it drives some inspiration or some optimism when I show you some of these therapies that are out there, potentially making headway. And if my story for a moment could be used as a parallel to some of those things that we talk about, new innovations in autism, new innovations in plant therapy, new innovations in gene therapy. I had a new innovation in infection control and wound care, and it started with nothing, and now it's a public organization with a chance to help millions. So my story could probably be an episode, about, how antiquated the wound care products were in this country, 4 or 5 generations behind what they were in Europe, and, you know, decades behind where they should be, in my opinion, as far as the regulatory frameworks. But the story of Turn, Turn Therapeutics, as the company is called, was one of those, we are so far behind. And here is somebody who is working on something that might actually drive innovation forward. And now it exists. If anything, this episode was not done to talk about, what I accomplished in the company, because I want this podcast to be totally independent of that. I want it to be a moment where all of you who feel that whatever condition you're facing, whatever, difficulties your child may be facing, there are people out there like me who are working on it. There are people out there like me who are working on solutions. There are people out there with whys that are strong enough to suffer anyhow that want to help you too. And if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an innovator, if you're one of the guests that has been on or one of the guests that I get a chance to meet in the future, I hope that where our company has gone, where Turn has gone, can just inspire you to keep working, to not give up hope that you have the chance of actually reaching people, of actually helping others, of meeting patients like I got a chance to do who hug you crying because of how much you changed their lives. There's no paycheck that could ever account for that kind of a feeling. So what I got a chance to do last week may have been something that people who build organizations for financial reasons probably consider, the goal in itself. To me, it was really just a moment where I got to celebrate with all of the people who supported me along the way, all of my friends, all of my family. And it felt a bit like, maybe putting a stamp like, this is real. This is where my imposter syndrome gets real intense. Like, okay, like maybe this is the moment I can decide this is actually real when, like, there's a NASDAQ logo below me. But it also symbolized a moment where from here, I can help even more people. We were somewhat narrow before with, how much we could work on, but now we have so much more access to resources that it can be many indications, many conditions, many diseases that need help and have lacked in innovation. I can have a chance to really push those forward. And for those of you out there who just for a moment, today, tomorrow, the day after, a month from now, feel like giving up, don't. Please. And I swear, if you need a motivational pep talk, find a way to get a hold of me, email the show. I'll call you myself. Put it in the comments, speak to me about it. We need people out there who can suffer the hows because the whys are strong. So I'm just going to leave this episode with a clip of the speech that I had the honor of giving actually at the NASDAQ bell ringing ceremony, they call it, when you close the market, which was cool. They invited me to do it. It was a huge honor. And I talked about the word impossible in there a lot, about how impossible isn't a rule to us. It's really an opinion, about how companies like Apple and Google and IBM and Tesla might have been considered impossible at one point in history. And now they're the biggest, stocks on the chart. So here we are. Impossible is obviously an opinion until it becomes a real thing. I want you to remember that what you're working on, even if it feels impossible, it's probably just an opinion. Make up your own mind of whether or not it's possible. And if you need a story to reflect upon or a motivational moment, listen to the speech that I'm about to give and think about how different the world might be if everybody who started those companies decided, nah, this is impossible, we're going to stop. So 9 years ago, Turn wasn't a company. It was just me. Jumped on a plane, flew 500,000 miles over a couple of years with nothing but an iPhone and a credit card.
It is my great pleasure to welcome your founder and Chief Executive Officer, Bradley Burnam of Turn Therapeutics, and the entire Turn Therapeutics team to the NASDAQ family. Welcome, everyone. Turn Therapeutics was founded by a patient for patients. At the heart of every innovation is a commitment to develop products that are safe, effective, and most importantly, accessible.
Turn was built on a shoestring with an absolute disdain for waste and a complete disregard for routine. Whatever the algorithm is or was, I say we shredded it. And I gotta tell you, standing on the trading floor after starting on the garage floor, it feels like we need to rethink the word impossible a little bit. They told me it's impossible to mix oil and water. We have a liquid and oil drug in phase 2 right now that says otherwise. They said you can't get an FDA clearance without zillion-dollar consultants. I got my first one for 24 grand at a public computer. They said you can't build a company of this scale at 1/10, maybe 1/20th the spend, and here we are. And finally, they said you can't make drugs safe, effective, and affordable, all while manufacturing in the United States. And to that, I just say, watch us. For all of us at Turn, this is not an end, this is not an exit, this is the exact opposite. It's our way of proving, just on a global scale now, that you can do exceeding amounts of good and exceedingly well at the same time. It's possible. So thank you for this honor. Maybe when I watch the video back, I'll believe it happened. Until then, I have no interest in waking up.